The John Lennon mystery finally solved, and isn't good. The world mourned when John Lennon was gunned down outside his New York home, but beyond the headlines lies a disturbing web of ignored warnings, questionable security failures, and shadowy figures. Decades later, the full truth of what led to his assassination is more unsettling than anyone expected. It was a cold Monday night in New York City, December 8, 1980. The streets of the Upper West Side buzzed with the ordinary pace of winter pedestrians, cab headlights reflecting in puddles, and the distant echo of traffic down 72nd Street. Just outside the Dakota Building, one of the city's oldest and eeriest Gothic apartment complexes, John Lennon, former Beatle, activist, icon, was walking home with his wife, Yoko Ono. It was just before 11 p.m. The moment seemed quiet, ordinary even. Then came the shots. 5 of them, loud, crisp, echoing in the corridor of the archway. 4 of those bullets would hit Lennon, 2 in the back, 2 through the shoulder. He staggered forward, up the steps, before collapsing in a pool of blood at the concierge desk. A haunting detail, his final words, whispered to the doorman, were, "I've been shot." Within minutes, a patrol car whisked him to Roosevelt Hospital, but it was too late. By the time doctors tried to revive him, John Lennon was dead. He was 40 years old. And just like that, one of the most transformative cultural voices of the 20th century was silenced in an act that felt both random and strangely inevitable. The official story was swift and simple. The killer was identified as 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, a security guard from Hawaii. Earlier that evening, he had approached Lennon with a copy of Double Fantasy, Lennon's new album, and asked for an autograph. John, gracious as always, obliged. Chapman waited for hours in the shadows of the Dakota, and then, without warning, pulled the trigger. He stayed on the scene, calmly reading The Catcher in the Rye, telling police later, "I did it to be famous." The world reeled. Candlelight vigils broke out in New York, London, Tokyo, and Paris. Crowds of fans gathered outside the Dakota, sobbing, singing Imagine through their grief. It was the end of an era. For many, it felt like the 1960s, with all its dreams of peace, rebellion, and transformation, had finally died with Lennon. But as the days turned to weeks and the years marched on, certain details refused to sit still. Why did Chapman remain at the scene so calmly? Why did he make bizarre references to being programmed or commanded by unseen forces? Why was there no trial, only a sudden guilty plea and a life sentence, with no further investigation? Why did the FBI already have such an extensive file on Lennon? And why did surveillance agencies, including the CIA, seem to shadow his every move? Official narratives, some critics argue, conveniently overlooked deeper truths. Lennon wasn't just a rock star. He had become a political agitator, a figure of international influence who openly denounced war, racism, and American imperialism in the heart of Nixon's America. He was, at one time, even labeled a threat to national security. You have to be a bastard to make it, and that's a fact. And the Beatles were the biggest bastards on Earth. It was a darkly prophetic statement. Over the years, alternative theories blossomed, some grounded in fact, others in speculation. The most persistent, that Lennon's death wasn't just a tragic act of fan violence, but something more coordinated. That Mark David Chapman was not merely a disturbed lone wolf, but an manipulated asset. That the machinery of state, with its long history of surveillance, covert action, and political silencing, may have had reasons to fear Lennon. After all, this was the man who told the world to give peace a chance, who aligned himself with Black Panther leaders, anti-war radicals, and global dissidents, who dared to use fame as a platform to challenge empire. And in 1980, just as he was about to re-enter the public arena after 5 years of quiet domestic life, John Lennon was taken out with military precision. Historians still debate whether Lennon's death was a tragic coincidence or a calculated erasure. Some claim that timing was too convenient. Others argue it was simply the final act in a series of personal and political storms that had been building for years. But one thing is certain: the world changed that night. The dreamer was gone, and the mystery had only begun. Before the fame, before the peace signs and the protests, before the world knew his name, John Lennon was just a boy from Liverpool, a sharp-tongued, sharp-eyed child with a smirk that could either charm or wound. Born during an air raid on October 9, 1940, in the midst of the Nazi Blitz, his arrival into the world was already marked by chaos. While bombs fell from the sky, Julia Stanley gave birth to John Winston Lennon at Liverpool Maternity Hospital, naming him after Winston Churchill, a wartime hope in human form. But peace would remain elusive in John's early years. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman, often absent and ultimately unreliable. By the time John was 5, Alf had effectively disappeared. His mother, Julia, a free spirit who loved music and men in equal measure, was deemed too unstable to raise a child full-time. The result? John was handed over to her older sister, Mary Mimi Smith, a stern and no-nonsense woman who lived with her husband George at 251 Menlove Avenue, known forever to Beatles fans as Mendips. Mimi offered structure, but not warmth. She forbade John from playing guitar in the house, famously saying, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." A quote that would one day be repurposed in interviews and biographies, a tragic punchline. Despite the prim exterior of his suburban upbringing, young John was unruly, imaginative, and deeply wounded. He drew grotesque cartoons, wrote nonsense poetry, and performed mock interviews with invisible audiences. His report cards read like small explosions. "Certainly on the road to failure," one teacher scrawled. "Hopeless," wrote another. And yet, beneath the rebellion, there was brilliance. Julia re-entered his life occasionally, bringing with her a rare gift: music. She played the banjo and piano, teaching him his first chords and introducing him to the raw energy of early rock and roll. Their time together was short-lived. In 1958, when John was 17, Julia was struck and killed by a car just yards from Mimi's house. The trauma cracked something deep inside him. Years later, Lennon would confess, "It was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I lost her twice, once as a mother, once as a friend." This tragedy compounded an already complex emotional landscape. John became sarcastic, biting, sometimes cruel. He cultivated a reputation as a class clown and a troublemaker, but one with magnetism. At Liverpool's Quarry Bank High School, he formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, a curious blend of traditional jazz, folk, and American rhythm and blues. Skiffle was the sound of a generation in transition, and John, dressed in drain-pipe trousers and wielding a cheap guitar, became its local king. But rebellion didn't just manifest in music. John was a prankster and a provocateur. He read the Daily Howl over the school intercom, parodying teachers and politics. He walked with a swagger that dared others to challenge him. In truth, it was a shield, a way to hide his deep, unspoken insecurities. Historically, the post-war British youth were caught in cultural limbo. The empire was shrinking, rationing still echoed in daily life, and a new identity was struggling to be born. Lennon embodied this rupture, too clever for conformity, too angry for quiet submission. He admired Elvis, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard, not just for their music, but for their audacity. He once said of Elvis, "When I heard Heartbreak Hotel, I knew that was the end for me." But even in those early days, Lennon's contradictions were visible. He was sensitive yet mean, insightful yet impulsive, artistic yet destructive. He could write poetry and punch a classmate in the same breath, a pattern that would follow him throughout life. A quirky anecdote that still haunts Beatles lore. John once invited a friend over to just show off his new art supplies, then locked him in a closet for several hours just to see what he would do. Lennon later laughed it off, but it pointed to the darker corners of his psyche, curious, cold, and fascinated with control.
By 1966, the Beatles had become not just a band, but the axis around which an entire generation seemed to spin. Their albums were more than records. They were statements. Their haircuts, more than fashion. They were symbols. And John Lennon, never far from the center, was quietly suffocating in the noise. At first glance, everything was golden. Revolver had pushed their sound into uncharted territory with songs like Tomorrow Never Knows, driven by John's growing obsession with mysticism, sound loops, and LSD. The band had conquered America, then the world. They were rich, untouchable, adored. But John was slipping further into himself. On March 4, 1966, an offhand comment to journalist Maureen Cleave ignited global controversy. "Christianity will go," Lennon said. "It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue with that. I'm right, and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now." He wasn't boasting, not in the way headlines later suggested. He was musing about religion's fading grip in modern society. But the backlash, especially in America's Bible Belt, was swift and merciless. Radio stations burned Beatles records in protest. Death threats poured in. The Ku Klux Klan staged demonstrations outside concerts. In Memphis, a firecracker went off mid-show, and Lennon visibly flinched, believing it was a gunshot. That moment would haunt him. "If I'd said television was more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it," he later reflected, weary and deflated. "I wasn't saying I was better or greater, but I believed it. I was right. I will be proved right." Analysts still debate whether this was the moment Lennon began to detach himself from the Beatles emotionally, not just because of the backlash, but because of the realization that fame could turn on a dime. 1966 would also mark the end of the Beatles as a touring band. After a grueling, dangerous final run through Asia and the US, culminating in the chaos of their final concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park, they quit the road for good. The screaming had gotten louder than the music, and for John, it was no longer tolerable. Returning to London, he drifted into silence and psychedelics. He explored avant-garde art, attended gallery shows, and sank into intense experimentation. LSD became a regular part of his routine, not for escape, but for expansion. He believed it cracked open reality, peeled back layers of social programming, and revealed something raw. But not all trips were enlightening. Some were dark. On one occasion, John reportedly took acid and stood on the rooftop of his home for hours, convinced he could fly. Friends talked him down. Later, he would write, "The worst trip I ever had. I thought I was dead. I thought I was Jesus. And then I thought I was a genius." In early 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a psychedelic odyssey that many consider their greatest achievement. Lennon's fingerprints are everywhere. The haunting A Day in the Life, the trippy Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and the eerie Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. These weren't pop songs. They were fragments of dreams, stitched together with studio wizardry and Lennon's increasingly surreal imagination. And yet, even as they pushed musical boundaries, John's personal life was deteriorating. His marriage to Cynthia had become little more than a ghost. He was emotionally unavailable. frequently absent and deeply isolated. He would often sit at his piano at 4 a.m., playing strange melodies to himself in the dark. In early 1968, during the recording of the White Album, tensions within the band began to boil. Yoko Ono, whom he'd met at a London art exhibition in 1966, became a constant presence in the studio. Her arrival sparked unease. For Paul, it felt like an intrusion. For George and Ringo, it disrupted the unspoken rules of the group. But for John, it was salvation. "I'd never met anyone," he later said, "who made me feel that I wasn't alone." One quirky yet telling moment. During the White Album sessions, Yoko sat silently beside John's microphone, often holding his hand as he sang. At one point, when she wasn't there, John insisted on recording with a mannequin of her standing nearby. Symbolic, defiant, and completely Lennon. Still, the cracks were now visible. Long hours in the studio turned into arguments. Songs became more individualized. The band members no longer shared meals or laughs, just space. Yet even as the Beatles fractured, Lennon was creating some of his most personal work. Julia, written for his lost mother, Your Blues, a primal cry of depression, and Revolution, his first overtly political single. And still, questions persisted. Was Lennon leading the Beatles anymore? Or was he dismantling them from the inside? Some scholars believe he was deliberately sabotaging the myth. Others suggest he simply evolved faster than the group could follow. He wanted to scream, not croon, to protest, not perform. As the 1960s spiraled into assassinations, riots, and war, Lennon no longer believed the Beatles were enough. The era of mop taps and suits had ended. The age of fire and truth had begun. And John Lennon, broken, brilliant, and burning, was about to step out from the shadow of the world's biggest band.
The myth says Paul McCartney broke up the Beatles. The truth? John Lennon walked away first. It happened quietly and not in front of cameras. September 20, 1969. John, Yoko, Paul, George, and Ringo were sitting with business manager Alan Klein in Apple headquarters. They were discussing upcoming plans. McCartney, ever the planner, wanted to tour again. Lennon interrupted, coolly and without ceremony, "I want a divorce." Everyone froze. There was no dramatic fight, no angry walkout, just that phrase, sharp, inevitable, and final, like a pin pushed into a balloon. Lennon had made up his mind. By this point, the internal rot had spread throughout the Beatles machine. The death of their manager Brian Epstein in 1967 had left a leadership vacuum no one could fill. Apple Corps, their utopian business venture, had become a financial nightmare. Creative tensions were peaking. McCartney, driven and meticulous, was producing entire albums. George Harrison, once sidelined, was writing songs equal in brilliance to Lennon-McCartney. And John? John was drifting. He was in love with Yoko. He was strung out on heroin. He was preoccupied with politics, performance art, and spiritual crises. The Beatles no longer felt like his band. He later said, "It was like a job, a trap. We had to dress up and be Beatles." Still, his departure was kept secret, mostly for business reasons. A public announcement could complicate contracts, upset shareholders, and derail solo album launches. So John agreed to keep it quiet. Paul didn't. On April 10, 1970, McCartney issued a press release for his first solo album. In it, he confirmed the band's breakup. Headlines screamed, "Paul quits the Beatles." John was furious. He felt Paul had stolen the moment, the drama, the finality, the sympathy. In truth, John had emotionally left the group months earlier, but now it looked like Paul had ended it. "He used the Beatles to sell a record," Lennon snapped. "It wasn't even true. I was the one who left." The public was devastated. the most beloved band in history, was gone. For fans who'd grown up with Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Abbey Road, it felt like a divorce in the family. But for John, it was a release, the first breath of independence after years underwater. He wasted no time. In December 1970, Plastic Ono Band dropped like a bomb. Gone were the harmonies, the orchestrations, the polish. In their place, rawness, pain, and brutal truth. The album opened with church bells and ended with the word Amen. In between were primal howls, spare arrangements, and confessions so personal they bordered on uncomfortable. Lennon wasn't interested in approval anymore. He was doing what he called stripping it down to the bone. But the public, still mourning the Beatles' end, didn't understand this new version of their former idol. Some critics called it genius. Others dismissed it as self-indulgent therapy. Sales were modest. Lennon didn't care. One track stood out, God. In it, he lists everything he no longer believes in: magic, religion, kings, Elvis, even the Beatles. The final lines cut like a blade. I don't believe in Beatles. I just believe in me, Yoko and me, and that's reality. That lyric was the closing door on the past. In 1971, John and Yoko moved to New York City, a deliberate act of cultural exile. London had become claustrophobic. Apple was in chaos, and the UK tabloids treated them like freaks. New York offered anonymity, electricity, and revolution. From a modest apartment in Greenwich Village, John began crafting what many consider his most accessible solo work, Imagine. The title track, written in collaboration with Yoko, would become a global anthem, a secular prayer set to gentle piano chords. But behind its simple melody was a challenge. Imagine there's no heaven, no countries, no possessions. Many heard peace. Lennon meant revolution. It's virtually the Communist Manifesto, he said bluntly in a later interview, but because it's sugar-coated, people swallow it. Analysts still debate whether Lennon saw Imagine as a lullaby or a call to arms. Some claim he regretted its softness. Others argue he knew its power precisely because of that softness. Either way, the song transcended its moment, eventually becoming the most played song of his solo career. But beneath the success, tension lingered. Lennon felt betrayed by his former bandmates. A brutal war of words erupted, especially between him and Paul. In How Do You Sleep, John viciously attacked Paul. The only thing you'd done was yesterday, and since you've gone, you're just another day. It was cruel, intentional, and public. Paul was hurt. Fans were horrified. Yoko claimed John was purging his emotions. John later apologized, privately, but the scar remained. Behind the music, there was another war, with the US government. John's anti-war activism, his ties to radicals like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and his vocal opposition to the Vietnam War made him a target. In 1972, the Nixon administration began a full-scale campaign to deport him. FBI surveillance, wiretaps, redacted documents. John Lennon, former Beatle, was now considered a national security threat. One memo described him as having substantial anti-war influence and the ability to mobilize young people. But John refused to back down. He had let go of the Beatles. Now he was ready to take on something bigger. The man who once had the world screaming his name was now under surveillance. When John Lennon arrived in New York City in August 1971, he wasn't just escaping the mess of the Beatles, he was searching for freedom. But he soon discovered that his fight for personal autonomy had put him directly in the crosshairs of the most powerful government in the world. Lennon and Yoko moved into a modest apartment on Bank Street in Greenwich Village, a hotbed of bohemian radicalism, civil rights activism, and protest culture. John, always politically aware, but now truly politicized, embraced it with fervor. Gone were the velvet suits and Beatle boots. He walked the streets in denim and army jackets, blending in with students, artists, and organizers. He didn't just want to write about peace anymore, he wanted to live it, build it, and fight for it. His first major stand, the Vietnam War. Alongside Yoko, John threw himself into the anti-war movement. They organized concerts, appeared at rallies, and released tracks like Give Peace a Chance and Happy Xmas War is Over, the latter featuring a chilling children's choir and a billboard campaign that read, War is over, if you want it. The Nixon administration was watching. According to declassified FBI documents, John Lennon was placed under surveillance in 1971 due to his ties with political radicals. In particular, the White House feared that Lennon would organize mass youth voter turnout to unseat Nixon in the 1972 election. He had recently aligned with leftist organizers, planning a series of anti-war concerts meant to galvanize disenfranchised youth. This wasn't just celebrity activism, it was strategy. The government response? Aggressive and personal. Lennon's visa extension was denied. Deportation proceedings began. Immigration officers showed up at his door. He was accused of overstaying a 1968 conviction for cannabis possession in the UK, a petty charge, but now weaponized. They were trying to silence me, Lennon later said. They didn't want someone with my platform speaking to the kids. One quirky, lesser-known fact, Lennon once carried around a pocket constitution and quoted from it during immigration hearings. "I'm not trying to overthrow your government," he reportedly said. "I'm just trying to remind it what it says it stands for." For 3 years, the battle dragged on. Lennon hired lawyers, appealed rulings, and refused to be intimidated. The stress was enormous. Friends described him as increasingly paranoid, believing phones were tapped and that plainclothes officers followed him on the street. He wasn't wrong. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally monitored Lennon's file, which eventually swelled to over 300 pages. Tactics ranged from public smears to quiet threats. Political historian John Wiener, who later sued the government to release the files, described it as a campaign of harassment, not to imprison him, but to wear him down. Meanwhile, John's music reflected the pressure. His 1972 album, Sometime in New York City, was not a commercial.
After decades of noise, screaming fans, screaming headlines, screaming guitars, John Lennon went quiet. From 1975 to 1980, he disappeared from public life. No albums, no interviews, no tours, just silence. The man who had once declared himself more popular than Jesus was now baking bread. He had moved with Yoko and their newborn son Sean into the Dakota, an ornate, castle-like apartment building on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Its wrought iron balconies, spiked towers, and shadowed courtyard gave it an almost mythic aura. It was elegant, strange, and faintly haunted. It suited John perfectly. Inside apartment 72, he retreated. In those 5 years, Lennon embraced fatherhood with near-religious devotion. He rose early to feed Sean, read children's books aloud in exaggerated voices, and took him on long stroller walks through Central Park. He wasn't just playing the role of dad, he was rewriting himself from scratch. "I finally understood what love really is," he later said. "It's not screaming on a stage, it's a baby falling asleep in your arms." Gone was the angry prophet of Plastic Ono Band, the political agitator, the ex-Beatle, the LSD-era guru, all shelved. In their place was a man in an apron, humming old rockabilly songs while flipping pancakes. Yoko, meanwhile, took over the business. She handled their finances, real estate, and art investments with cool precision. Contrary to the public myth that she controlled John, Lennon himself insisted otherwise. "She runs things better than I ever could," he admitted. "I'm the dreamer, she's the realist." Still, the world couldn't make sense of it. How could John Lennon, that John Lennon, vanish so completely? Some speculated he was secretly ill. Others imagined he was creatively dried up. Some even whispered that the government had finally silenced him. In reality, Lennon was undergoing something few rock stars dared attempt. He was choosing peace over applause. But make no mistake, it wasn't always idyllic. John struggled with isolation, with addiction, with doubt. He drank again, relapsed briefly, and then pulled back. He gained weight, grew a beard, spent nights listening to old Beatles records alone, sometimes calling friends just to reminisce. One curious anecdote from the Dakota years: John became obsessed with sailing. In 1980, he spontaneously joined a small crew on a yacht headed for Bermuda. During a brutal storm, the captain became ill, and Lennon, with no experience, took the helm himself. For 6 hours, he steered through crashing waves and howling winds. He later called it a rebirth. He said, "I felt like I'd finally grown up. I faced death, I faced the ocean, and I didn't run." That trip would rekindle something dormant. While in Bermuda, Lennon began writing again, furiously. Lyrics poured out, melodies returned. After years of silence, the muse had come back. When he returned to New York, he entered the studio with Yoko. The result, Double Fantasy, a joint album, half his songs, half hers, a conversation in music about marriage, parenting, survival, and renewal. Tracks like Watching the Wheels and Beautiful Boy revealed a softer, wiser Lennon. They were reflective, even tender. This wasn't the John of Revolution. This was the John who had changed diapers, stared out at sunsets, and watched life roll by without needing to shape it. The album was released in November 1980. Reviews were mixed at first. Some critics found it too domestic, too soft, but John didn't care. "I'm not interested in being the hero anymore. I'm interested in being alive." Yoko described this period as their second honeymoon. They were closer than ever. The drama of the 1970s had passed. The noise had faded. They were, at last, happy. But happiness for John Lennon was always fragile. Analysts still debate whether Lennon would have ever returned to full-time music. Some believe Double Fantasy was only the beginning of a second act. Others argue he was already preparing to fade away again, content to be a father first, artist second. One eerie detail from these final months: Lennon frequently spoke about death. Not morbidly, just with a strange calm. He told friends he didn't fear dying, only being forgotten. "You either get remembered as a saint or as a lunatic. Me, I'm probably both." In a twist of bitter fate, John Lennon's Dakota years, the most private and peaceful of his life, would end in the most public way imaginable. Just as he opened himself up to the world again, the world came crashing in. And someone who had once asked for an autograph, was waiting in the shadows to end it all. December 8th, 1980 was supposed to be ordinary. John Lennon and Yoko Ono spent the morning giving interviews. They posed for Annie Leibovitz of Rolling Stone. In the photo that would become legendary, John is curled beside Yoko, naked, fetal, vulnerable, kissing her cheek as she lies clothed and still. It was raw, unguarded, symbolic. Later that afternoon, a fan stood outside the Dakota holding a copy of Double Fantasy. He asked for an autograph. John smiled, signed the album, and posed for a photo. That fan was Mark David Chapman. A few hours later, John and Yoko headed to the record plant on 44th Street. They were working on a new track, Walking on Thin Ice, a dance-influenced song with Yoko's vocals and Lennon's biting guitar. It would be the last thing he ever recorded. At 10:50 p.m., they returned home. As they walked beneath the archway of the Dakota's entrance, Chapman stepped out from the shadows. He drew a Charter Arms .38 special revolver and fired 5 shots. 4 hit John in the back and shoulder. John staggered forward, up the steps. He reached the security desk and murmured, "I've been shot," before collapsing. Yoko screamed. The doorman, Jose Perdomo, disarmed Chapman, who calmly removed his coat, dropped the gun, and pulled out a worn paperback, The Catcher in the Rye. When police arrived, Chapman was reading. He told them, "I acted alone," and referred to himself as the Catcher. In his twisted logic, Lennon was a phony, a reference to J.D. Salinger's anti-hero Holden Caldy's favorite insult. Chapman said Lennon preached peace but lived in luxury. His solution? Eliminate him. Officer James Moran and his partner were the first to act. With no time to wait for an ambulance, they lifted John into the back seat of their squad car and sped to Roosevelt Hospital. The officer later recalled John's fading pulse, his blood staining the back seat, Yoko crying beside him. At 11:15 p.m., John Lennon was pronounced dead. The attending physician, Dr. Stephen Lynn, later described the scene. Lennon had lost over 80% of his blood volume. "There was no chance," he said. "We worked on him for many minutes, but there was no heartbeat, no breath, nothing." News of his death broke slowly, then all at once. The first real confirmation came on Monday Night Football when broadcaster Howard Cosell interrupted the game to deliver the shocking announcement to millions. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building, was shot and killed. A stunned silence fell over living rooms across America. Outside the Dakota, hundreds, then thousands gathered. Some wept. Some sang Imagine through tears. Some stood silent, candles flickering in the winter wind. Within hours, vigils spread across continents. London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. The world had lost a voice, an icon, a friend. And yet, something didn't sit right. The circumstances of Lennon's death, a fan-turned-killer, a motive rooted in delusion, seemed at once simple and suspiciously neat. Conspiracy theory sprang up almost immediately. Was Chapman truly acting alone, or was there more beneath the surface? Analysts still debate this. Some point to Chapman's robotic calm, his seemingly programmed behavior, his obsession with Salinger's novel, and its repeated references to phonies and hidden agendas. Others note his connections to religious fundamentalism, mental illness, and his prior travel to Beirut during a period when CIA operations were active there. One particularly chilling theory involves Project Mica Ultra, the CIA's infamous mind control program that operated for decades in secret. Though never directly connected to Chapman, parallels in behavior, psychological dissociation, and scripted language have fueled speculation. Even Lennon himself had feared being silenced. In interviews leading up to his death, he spoke of feeling watched. He had long suspected government agencies were monitoring his movements, and thanks to FOIA-released FBI files, we now know they were. The files were thick, dating back to the early 70s, tracking his political affiliations, his friends.
In the decades following John Lennon's assassination, one voice rose above all others to preserve his memory: Yoko Ono. To some, she remained the villain, the woman who broke up the Beatles, who led John into artistic obscurity, who dared to speak when silence was expected. But to many more, she became something else entirely: the guardian of his legacy, his widow, his partner, his voice when his could no longer be heard. In the immediate aftermath of John's death, Yoko was a portrait of controlled devastation. She declined a funeral, explaining that John would not have wanted one. Instead, she urged the world to mourn in silence. 10 minutes, No words, just reflection. On December 14, 1980, cities across the globe fell quiet. From Tokyo to Toronto, from Central Park to Liverpool, the world stood still. Then she built a monument, not in marble or bronze, but in music, art, and public memory. In 1985, Yoko founded Strawberry Fields in New York's Central Park, just across from the Dakota. The black and white mosaic at its heart bears a single word: imagine. It became a place of pilgrimage, not just for Beatles fans, but for anyone longing for peace. But her preservation efforts extended far beyond that. She managed John's estate, authorized reissues, and oversaw the release of Milk and Honey, the follow-up album to Double Fantasy. She opened Lennon's personal archives. She co-produced documentaries, exhibitions, and remastered records. Her fingerprints are on nearly every posthumous Lennon project. And yet, controversy followed her like a shadow. In her stewardship of John's story, Yoko often made choices that raised eyebrows. She altered credits on certain songs. She curated public narratives with firm precision. In some documentaries, Paul McCartney's role was minimized. On others, George Harrison and Ringo Starr were nearly absent. Fans and scholars still debate whether this was about protection or control. Some see Yoko's efforts as genuine acts of love. Others argue she recast history to suit a particular vision, one in which John's identity as a Beatle was secondary to his role as her partner, her equal, her co-creator. Paul McCartney remained noticeably quiet for years after Lennon's death. The grief, he later explained, was too raw. In the press, his reaction was famously subdued. When asked for comment shortly after the murder, Paul replied, "It's a drag." The statement was criticized as cold, even callous, but McCartney later clarified that he was in shock and didn't know what else to say. Privately, he mourned deeply. He once said that every time he played Here Today, a ballad written to John in 1982, he felt he was having a conversation that never got to happen. Still, the silence between Paul and Yoko remained. Though they worked together on the Beatles anthology in the 1990s, their relationship was stiff, respectful, but tense. One of the most glaring examples of their disagreement came during a dispute over songwriting credits. Paul requested that songs he primarily wrote, like Yesterday, be listed as McCartney-Lennon instead of the traditional Lennon-McCartney. Yoko refused. To her, it wasn't about ego, it was about legacy. Analysts still debate Yoko's motives. Was she protecting John's artistic vision, or rewriting history to enshrine herself as his final and most important collaborator? Meanwhile, Paul took a different route in remembering John. Rather than curating archives, he poured his emotions into performance. He included tributes to John in his concerts. He sang Here Today with mist in his eyes. And perhaps most powerfully, he allowed the pain to live in the music, not the museum. George Harrison was more guarded. In rare comments, he mourned John as both a brother and a stranger. "He was always like my big brother, but we drifted, we fought, and then, suddenly, he was gone." George also took solace in spirituality. He believed death was not the end, that John had moved on to another plane. Ringo, ever the emotional compass, said it best, "I still miss him. I always will. Every time I pass the Dakota, I look up and think, he should still be there." In the years since, documentaries, memoirs, and conspiracy theories have clouded the facts. But one thing remains clear. Everyone close to John has their own version of him. Yoko's John, Paul's John, Julian's John, Sean's John. Julian Lennon, John's first son with Cynthia, had a complicated relationship with his father, one shaped by absence, trauma, and longing. "He was a hypocrite," Julian once said. "He could talk about peace and love to the world, but couldn't show it to his first family." Julian's words struck many as harsh, but honest. Sean Lennon, raised in the Dakota, adored by John in his later years, remembers a different man. Playful, attentive, musical.
In interviews, he describes a father who changed diapers, cooked breakfasts, and read bedtime stories. 2 sons, 2 truths. 1 absent father. In that absence, Yoko stepped in, not just as widow, but as architect. She held the pen, she painted the frame, and in doing so, she both preserved and defined the Lennon legacy. Was it fair? Was it accurate? Was it necessary? Analysts still debate that, but one fact remains. Without Yoko, we might have forgotten him. With her, we never could.
In the decades following John Lennon's assassination, one voice rose above all others to preserve his memory: Yoko Ono. To some, she remained the villain, the woman who broke up the Beatles, who led John into artistic obscurity, who dared to speak when silence was expected. But to many more, she became something else entirely: the guardian of his legacy, his widow, his partner, his voice, when his could no longer be heard. In the immediate aftermath of John's death, Yoko was a portrait of controlled devastation. She declined a funeral, explaining that John would not have wanted one. Instead, she urged the world to mourn in silence. 10 minutes, no words, just reflection. On December 14, 1980, cities across the globe fell quiet. From Tokyo to Toronto, from Central Park to Liverpool, the world stood still. Then she built a monument, not in marble or bronze, but in music, art, and public memory. In 1985, Yoko founded Strawberry Fields in New York's Central Park, just across from the Dakota. The black and white mosaic at its heart bears a single word: imagine. It became a place of pilgrimage, not just for Beatles fans, but for anyone longing for peace. But her preservation efforts extended far beyond that. She managed John's estate, authorized reissues, and oversaw the release of Milk and Honey, the follow-up album to Double Fantasy. She opened Lennon's personal archives. She co-produced documentaries, exhibitions, and remastered records. Her fingerprints are on nearly every posthumous Lennon project. And yet, controversy followed her like a shadow. In her stewardship of John's story, Yoko often made choices that raised eyebrows. She altered credits on certain songs. She curated public narratives with firm precision. In some documentaries, Paul McCartney's role was minimized. On others, George Harrison and Ringo Starr were nearly absent. Fans and scholars still debate whether this was about protection or control. Some see Yoko's efforts as genuine acts of love. Others argue she recast history to suit a particular vision, one in which John's identity as a Beatle was secondary to his role as her partner, her equal, her co-creator. Paul McCartney remained noticeably quiet for years after Lennon's death. The grief, he later explained, was too raw. In the press, his reaction was famously subdued. When asked for comment shortly after the murder, Paul replied, "It's a drag." The statement was criticized as cold, even callous, but McCartney later clarified that he was in shock and didn't know what else to say. Privately, he mourned deeply. He once said that every time he played Here Today, a ballad written for John in 1982, he felt he was having a conversation that never got to happen. Still, the silence between Paul and Yoko remained. Though they worked together on the Beatles anthology in the 1990s, their relationship was stiff, respectful, but tense. One of the most glaring examples of their disagreement came during a dispute over songwriting credits. Paul requested that songs he primarily wrote, like Yesterday, be listed as McCartney-Lennon instead of the traditional Lennon-McCartney. Yoko refused. To her, it wasn't about ego, it was about legacy. Analysts still debate Yoko's motives. Was she protecting John's artistic vision or rewriting history to enshrine herself as his final and most important collaborator? Meanwhile, Paul took a different route in remembering John. Rather than curating archives, he poured his emotions into performance. He included tributes to John in his concerts. He sang Here Today with mist in his eyes. And perhaps most powerfully, he allowed the pain to live in the music, not the museum. George Harrison was more guarded.
In rare comments, he mourned John as both a brother and a stranger. He said, quote, "He was always like my big brother, but we drifted, we fought, and then suddenly, he was gone." George also took solace in spirituality. He believed death was not the end, that John had moved on to another plane. Ringo, ever the emotional compass, said it best, quote, "I still miss him. I always will. Every time I pass the Dakota, I look up and think he should still be there." In the years since, documentaries, memoirs, and conspiracy theories have clouded the facts. But one thing remains clear. Everyone close to John has their own version of him. Yoko's John, Paul's John, Julian's John, Sean's John. Julian Lennon, John's first son with Cynthia, had a complicated relationship with his father, one shaped by absence, trauma, and longing. He said, quote, "He was a hypocrite. He could talk about peace and love to the world, but couldn't show it to his first family." Julian's words struck many as harsh, but honest. Sean Lennon, raised in the Dakota, adored by John in his later years, remembers a different man, playful, attentive, musical. In interviews, he describes a father who changed diapers, cooked breakfasts, and read bedtime stories. 2 sons, 2 truths, 1 absent father. In that absence, Yoko stepped in, not just as widow, but as architect. She held the pen, she painted the frame. And in doing so, she both preserved and defined the Lennon legacy. Was it fair? Was it accurate? Was it necessary? Analysts still debate that. But one fact remains. Without Yoko, we might have forgotten him. With her, we never could.